Robert Lawson had lived peacefully beside Clearwater Creek for 15 years. His 10-acre property was his sanctuary, densely wooded with a natural waterfall that created a soothing backdrop to his modest cabin. The letter from Sunny Pines Homeowners Association arrived on a crisp autumn morning, informing him that as part of a community sustainability initiative, they would be constructing a small hydroelectric station utilizing his waterfall. The letter cited a little-known clause in property regulations regarding abundant natural resources and stated construction would begin in 30 days. Robert was stunned. He'd never even joined their HOA, as his property predated the development by decades. He read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling slightly as the implications sank in. The waterfall wasn't just some feature on his land. It was the heart of his property, the reason he purchased this remote parcel after leaving his high-stress engineering job in the city. The constant symphony of rushing water had healed him through divorce, health scares, and the loss of his parents. And now some suburban committee wanted to harness it for powering their community hot tub and landscape lighting. The letter was printed on expensive cardstock with the Sunny Pines logo embossed in gold at the top, a stylized pine tree rising above wavy lines representing the creek that flowed from Robert's property through their development. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same creek they'd complained about when it occasionally rose during spring thaws was now being described as a community resource and untapped renewable energy opportunity. That afternoon, Robert drove the winding road that connected his secluded property to the Sunny Pines development a mile downstream. What had once been farmland when he'd first moved in was now a collection of large homes with manicured lawns, each one bigger and more ostentatious than the next. The community clubhouse gleamed with fresh paint and expansive windows, a testament to the hefty HOA fees these residents willingly paid. He parked his weathered pickup truck in the visitors section, feeling immediately out of place among the luxury SUVs and European sedans. Inside the clubhouse, a receptionist with perfectly coiffed hair glanced at his muddy boots and worn flannel shirt with barely disguised disdain. "I need to speak with someone about this letter," Robert said, sliding the notice across the marble counter. "The board doesn't take unscheduled meetings," she replied without bothering to look at the document. "You can submit your concerns in writing or attend the monthly meeting next Thursday." "This isn't a concern about lawn height or fence color," Robert insisted, keeping his voice level. "This is about a major construction project on private property, my property, that I've never authorized." The receptionist sighed dramatically, then picked up a phone. After a hushed conversation, she directed him to wait in a small conference room. 20 minutes later, Victoria Harrington swept in, dressed in a tailored business suit despite it being Saturday. Her practiced smile didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Lawson, I presume? I'm Victoria Harrington, president of the Sunny Pines HOA. I understand you have questions about our green energy initiative. We're quite proud of it, actually. It's going to put Sunny Pines on the map as the first fully sustainable planned community in the region." Robert noticed she was already speaking, as if the project were a done deal, recording device in hand as if documenting a stakeholder interview for a press release. In that moment, he realized this wasn't going to be as simple as pointing out an administrative error. This was something else entirely, a calculated move by people accustomed to getting their way, people who viewed his quiet existence as nothing more than an untapped resource waiting to be exploited. In the following weeks, Robert tried every diplomatic approach possible. He attended HOA meetings where he was largely ignored. He consulted with lawyers who confirmed the HOA had overstepped their boundaries, but warned litigation could take years. The HOA president, Victoria Harrington, a former corporate executive with political ambitions, dismissed his concerns with practiced condescension. "It's for the greater good," she repeated, showing him elaborate plans for their green energy showcase that would power their community clubhouse, tennis courts, and decorative lighting. Robert noticed that Victoria's home, along with those of other board members, sat at the highest elevation in the development. At the third HOA meeting Robert attended, he came prepared with documentation, land surveys, property deeds dating back 50 years, and a letter from a local environmental protection group expressing concerns about disrupting the natural waterway. He'd spent nearly $2,000 on legal advice and countless hours researching property laws. The small meeting room was packed with Sunny Pines residents, most of whom seemed more interested in the promised reduction in utility bills than in where their electricity would come from. "If I could just have 5 minutes to present some important information," Robert said when Victoria opened the floor for new business. Victoria checked her watch. "We have a full agenda, Mr. Lawson. Perhaps you could email your concerns." "I sent 3 emails with no response," Robert replied, his patience wearing thin. "This project affects my land directly, and I'd like the chance to." "This project affects all of us," interrupted Gerald Hoffman, the HOA treasurer who owned the largest house in the development. "Sunny Pines is committed to reducing our carbon footprint. Are you against environmental progress, Mr. Lawson?" The framing of the question turned several heads in Robert's direction, disapproving murmurs rippling through the crowd. Robert felt the conversation being skillfully manipulated. "I've lived beside that creek for 15 years, he said, raising his voice slightly. "I drink its water. I've planted hundreds of native trees to prevent erosion. Don't lecture me about environmental stewardship." Victoria smoothly intervened, her corporate crisis management skills evident. "We appreciate your passion for the environment, which is exactly why this project makes sense. Our engineers assure us the impact will be minimal and the benefits substantial." Later, as residents mingled over wine and cheese, another HOA expense Robert noted, he approached Victoria privately, hoping for a more reasonable conversation. "The waterfall is on my property," he said simply. "I never signed any agreement giving access or rights to the HOA." Victoria sipped her wine, perfectly composed. "According to county records, the waterway is a shared resource. Our legal team has thoroughly vetted this project." She lowered her voice. "Besides, fighting this would be expensive and ultimately futile. The board is unanimous, and frankly, one holdout against community progress doesn't generate much sympathy." As she walked away to chat with a town council member she'd invited, Robert caught a glimpse of architectural renderings left on a nearby table. The glossy images showed not just a small hydroelectric station, but a substantial facility with viewing platforms and educational plaques, essentially a tourist attraction built around his once private waterfall. And in the corner of one rendering, he spotted Victoria's name credited as Community Vision Director, alongside logos for her upcoming mayoral campaign. The pieces were falling into place, and none of them boded well for Robert or his peaceful existence. Construction began despite Robert's protests. Heavy machinery damaged his forest as workers cleared trees and diverted part of his creek. When Robert confronted the project manager, he was handed a cease and desist letter threatening legal action if he interfered with community improvements. That night, as Robert surveyed the damage to his beloved land, he discovered the construction had disturbed a natural rock formation that had been channeling the creek for centuries. An idea began to form, one that would require his engineering background and intimate knowledge of the land's topography. The morning the bulldozers arrived, Robert stood at the edge of his property, arms crossed, watching as the machines tore into the earth. The construction crew foreman, a burly man named Mike, approached with an apologetic expression that didn't match his determined stride. "Look, I'm just doing my job," Mike said, handing Robert a thick envelope. "But the boss said to give you this if you showed up." Inside was a formal cease and desist letter on expensive law firm stationery, threatening Robert with trespassing charges if he entered the designated construction zone, and potential damages of up to $50,000 for any delays he caused to the community-approved infrastructure project. The letter was signed by Victoria Harrington as HOA president and co-signed by a county commissioner Robert had never heard of. "They've got all the permits," Mike added, not quite meeting Robert's eyes. "Came through faster than anything I've seen in 20 years of construction. Someone pulled some serious strings." Robert watched in helpless rage as centuries-old trees were uprooted and topsoil was scraped away. By mid-afternoon, the pristine banks of his creek were muddied and transformed, with concrete forms being set for the foundation of what was clearly going to be much larger than the small station described in the initial letter. After the work crew left for the day, Robert ventured down to assess the damage. The waterfall still flowed, but the construction had already changed its character. The sound was different, sharper, as the water found new pathways around the disrupted stream. He knelt by the water's edge, running his fingers through the current that was now clouded with silt. That's when he noticed it, a massive flat stone that had been dislodged from its position at the head of the waterfall. For centuries, this keystone had directed the creek's flow, splitting it perfectly to create the cascade that made his waterfall so distinctive. Now it lay askew, partially submerged in a pool of muddy water. Robert sat on a fallen log, his mind drifting back to his years as a civil engineer before he'd sought a quieter life. He remembered projects in flood-prone areas, the careful calculations required to manage water flow, the respect required when reshaping natural watercourses. None of that respect was evident in the crude alterations before him. As dusk settled over the damaged landscape, Robert made his way back to his cabin. He pulled out his old drafting table, unused for years, and unrolled a topographical map of the entire watershed. His engineering training flickered back to life as his fingers traced the blue lines representing Clearwater Creek and its tributaries. The HOA had power, money, and connections, but Robert had something they didn't: an intimate understanding of how water moved through this land, and the knowledge of exactly how precarious their downstream position truly was. By midnight, surrounded by calculations and watershed projections, the outlines of a plan began to take shape. If they wanted to treat his land as a resource to be exploited, perhaps it was time they learned exactly how powerful that resource could be when not properly respected. Over the next month, Robert carefully studied the watershed maps of the entire area while pretending to accept defeat. He identified a crucial weakness in the HOA's hydroelectric plan. Their design failed to account for seasonal flooding patterns. With methodical precision, Robert began subtle modifications to the surrounding landscape. He reinforced the banks around his own cabin while strategically removing certain erosion barriers downstream. He installed additional drainage around his property while submitting seemingly cooperative suggestions to the HOA about improving their water management system, changes that Victoria proudly incorporated into their visionary plans. Robert's apparent surrender came as a relief to the Sunny Pines board. Victoria even invited him to a project update meeting, positioning him near her during the photo opportunity for the local newspaper. Community comes together for green energy. Read the headline, with Robert's grim face partially visible behind Victoria's beaming smile. The article mentioned him as a local resident who initially had concerns, but now supports the innovative project. He hadn't said any such thing, but protesting would only raise suspicions about his true intentions. Each morning, Robert hiked his property before the construction crews arrived. With careful precision, he reinforced the natural berms around his cabin and workshop, adding layers of river rock and compacted soil that would appear entirely natural to the untrained eye. He installed French drains that diverted underground water away from his structures, working methodically through the pre-dawn hours. During the day, he would casually engage with Mike, the construction foreman, offering coffee and seemingly innocent observations. "That spillway seems a bit narrow for spring runoff," he'd remark, or "those retention pools might need more capacity." Eager to avoid conflict with the property owner, Mike would make notes and occasionally adjust plans. "You know your stuff," Mike commented one afternoon. "You an engineer or something?" Robert shrugged. "I've lived with this creek a long time. You learn to respect its moods." By the third week, Robert had begun Phase 2, carefully removing certain erosion barriers downstream that the original developers had installed years before. Nothing dramatic, just strategic weakening of key points where high water would naturally seek the path of least resistance. To anyone watching, he appeared to be doing routine maintenance on his property boundaries. The masterstroke came when Victoria announced a community meeting to discuss final design elements for the hydroelectric station. Robert arrived with detailed suggestions for improving the water management system, carefully crafted recommendations that would, if implemented, ensure any overflow would be directed precisely where he wanted it. "I've been thinking about how to make this project more efficient," he told the board, unrolling design modifications that looked professional and thorough. These adjustments would increase power generation by nearly 15%. Victoria was delighted by his apparent change of heart, and even more so by the prospect of improved output statistics for her camping materials. The board approved his suggestions unanimously, with Victoria taking personal credit for bringing all stakeholders together. The watershed maps spread before them told the real story, one that only Robert could read. Like a chess player seeing 6 moves ahead, he had positioned every piece exactly where it needed to be. As he drove home that night, past the homes of the board members nestled in the development's lower elevations, Robert felt a twinge of guilt. But it vanished when he reached his property and saw the Scarra where his waterfall had once flowed undisturbed. They had made their choice. Now nature would make hers. Spring came early that year, bringing unusually heavy rains. Robert watched the water levels rise, knowing exactly what would happen next. The creek, now flowing through the modified channels, began to back up behind the HOA's poorly designed dam. The overflow followed the path Robert had subtly engineered, directly toward the lowest-lying homes in the development, sparing his reinforced property. As emergency sirens wailed in the distance, the water found its way to the community's electrical systems, causing a cascade of failures that shut down their pumps. By morning, the lower half of Sunny Pines resembled a lake, with water reaching the first-floor windows of many homes, including those of all 7 HOA board members. The rain began on a Tuesday evening, gentle at first, then steadily increasing to a downpour that continued through the night. Robert sat on his covered porch, listening to the rhythm on his metal roof, occasionally consulting the rain gauge he'd installed months ago. By dawn, nearly 4 inches had fallen, significant, but not yet enough. The forecast promised 3 more days of precipitation, a common spring weather pattern that the HOA's engineers had dramatically underestimated in their rush to complete the project. From his vantage point above the waterfall, Robert could see the newly constructed dam already straining. The concrete was solid enough, but the spillways he had helpfully suggested they narrow were proving inadequate. Water was backing up behind the structure, creating a widening pool that inched toward the expensive monitoring equipment installed near the shoreline. By Thursday afternoon, the water had overtopped the dam's auxiliary spillway, exactly as Robert had calculated it would. The flow followed the path of least resistance, which, thanks to his careful modifications of the landscape, led directly toward the Sunny Pines development, rather than dispersing through the woodland as it naturally would have. Robert's phone began buzzing with emergency alerts. Flash flood warning for Eastern County areas. Seek higher ground immediately. He watched as lights began flicking on throughout the development below, residents waking to the sound of rushing water. He didn't need to venture from his property to know what was happening. The water would be finding its way to Victoria's prized clubhouse first, surrounding it on 3 sides before seeping into the newly renovated basement, where they'd installed the electrical systems that controlled the community's gates, security cameras, and, ironically, the pumps designed to prevent flooding. From there, the cascade of failures would be automatic, power down, pumps offline, emergency generators swamped by rising water. The carefully designed runoff channels Robert had suggested for greater efficiency would ensure that the homes in the lowest lying areas, where the board members had built their showcase properties, would be the first affected. Around midnight, Robert heard the distant wail of emergency vehicles. Through the rain-soaked darkness, he could see flashing lights reflecting off the rising water in the valley below. The hydroelectric station, Victoria's pride and joy, was now partially submerged, its expensive turbines grinding to a halt as debris clogged the intakes. The creek had reclaimed its power, its force no longer harnessed but unleashed. By sunrise, the rain had finally stopped, but the damage was done. Clearwater Creek, swollen with 4 days of rain and no longer following its natural course, had transformed the lower half of Sunny Pines into a muddy lake. From his elevated cabin, Robert could see residents being evacuated by boat, personal belongings held high above the water that had invaded their homes. And there, being helped into an emergency dinghy, was Victoria Harrington herself, her tailored business attire replaced by hastily donned rain gear, her face a mask of disbelief as she surveyed the submerged community she had promised to lead into a sustainable future. The county declared a local state of emergency. When investigators arrived, they discovered multiple violations in the HOA's hydroelectric project. Robert's documentation of the entire ordeal, from the initial unauthorized letter to his ignored protests, became crucial evidence. The investigation revealed that Victoria had been planning to use this successful green initiative in her upcoming campaign for mayor. The HOA was ultimately held liable for millions in damages, their insurance refusing to cover unauthorized construction and improper environmental modification. As residents rebuilt, the HOA was disbanded, and a new community agreement was drafted, one that explicitly protected Robert's property rights and established a conservation easement for Clearwater Creek. Victoria and her allies moved away, their political aspirations as waterlogged as their former homes. Robert quietly returned to his peaceful existence, the natural flow of the creek restored, carrying away the last remnants of the ill-conceived hydroelectric station. In the flood's aftermath, county officials, state environmental inspectors, and insurance adjusters descended on Sunny Pines. Yellow caution tape surrounded the partially collapsed hydroelectric station. Its concrete walls cracked from the force of water they were never designed to withstand. The development resembled a war zone, mud-caked streets, waterlogged furniture piled on curbs, the acrid smell of mildew permeating the once pristine neighborhood. Robert received the formal request to provide testimony to the County Commissioner's investigation panel. He arrived with 3 cardboard boxes of meticulously organised documents. The original letter from the HOA, his written protests, certified mail receipts showing his unanswered correspondence, photographs documenting the unauthorised construction on his property, and most damning of all, recordings of HOA meetings where his concerns were dismissed. "You kept all this?" asked Commissioner Eleanor Reeves, leafing through the evidence. "When you live alone in the woods, you learn to be self-reliant," Robert replied simply. "That includes protecting yourself legally." The investigation uncovered a web of shortcuts and violations. The environmental impact study had been rushed through by a consulting firm owned by Victoria's brother-in-law. Permits had been approved without proper site inspections after donations to certain county officials' re-election campaigns. Most critically, the engineering specifications had ignored basic hydrology principles regarding seasonal water flow patterns, precisely as Robert had anticipated. At a tense community meeting held in the high school gymnasium, insurance representatives delivered the crushing news to Sunny Pines residents. Their homeowners' policies would not cover the majority of damages due to exclusions for man-made water diversion and unauthorized construction. The HOA's liability insurance similarly refused payment, citing willful negligence and failure to adhere to professional engineering standards. Victoria made a brief appearance at the meeting, entering through a side door and leaving before residents could confront her. Rumours circulated that she had already listed her water-damaged home and accepted a corporate position in another state. The mayoral campaign website quietly disappeared overnight. As summer arrived, Robert watched from his porch as construction crews dismantled the remains of the hydroelectric station. The county had approved a restoration plan for Clearwater Creek, one that Robert had helped design, emphasizing natural flow patterns and native vegetation. The settlement agreement included a conservation easement that would permanently protect both his property and the watershed from future development. One evening, Mike, the former construction foreman, stopped by Robert's cabin. "They're saying downstream that you somehow engineered this whole thing," he said, glancing at Robert with newfound respect. "That you knew exactly what would happen when the rains came." Robert sipped his coffee, listening to the waterfall that once again flowed freely. "Nature has a way of reclaiming what's hers," he replied. "I just helped her remember the path."